What if everything you had worked for, everything you had built, your career, your identity, was suddenly stripped away in an instant just because of the color of your skin? Dr. Elijah Davis was a respected doctor, a professional who had earned his place in the world. He wasn't just walking down the street. He was on his way to save lives. But when a police officer stopped him without cause, everything changed. "You don't belong here," the officer said, his voice dripping with suspicion. Elijah tried to explain, tried to tell him he was on his way to work, but the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he assumed something far worse. Elijah was a fraud, a man playing at a life he had no right to live. In a moment of shocking arrogance, the officer handcuffed Elijah, dragging him through the streets like a common criminal. A man who had spent years in medical school, who had earned the trust of his patients, was now being treated like a criminal. But what happened next left everyone stunned. The officer, whose mind was made up, would soon realize that the man he had humiliated wasn't just any man. He was an undercover doctor, a pillar of the community. And the revelation? It would shake the foundation of everything that officer believed. But what would this moment of truth mean for Elijah, and for a society that judges based on appearances? Dr. Elijah Davis was no stranger to adversity. Growing up in a small, working-class neighborhood, he had always felt the weight of expectations on his shoulders. As one of the few black students in his class, he had fought tooth and nail to prove himself worthy of the dreams he had. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had a purpose, a calling to help those in need. Medicine was his passion, and from a young age, Elijah had worked tirelessly to earn a scholarship, graduate from medical school, and ultimately become one of the most respected doctors in the city. But despite his credentials, the accolades, and the years of sacrifice, Elijah couldn't escape the feeling that the world was watching him differently. As a black man in a predominantly white field, he often found himself having to prove his worth, not just to patients, but to colleagues and even strangers on the street. He knew that every time he walked out of his house in a suit, there would be a moment when someone would question whether he truly belonged. That morning, as he headed to the hospital for a routine shift, Elijah didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. He had just seen a few patients, read over some medical charts, and was headed to grab a quick cup of coffee before his next consultation. His footsteps were purposeful, his mind focused on the work that awaited him. But as he turned a corner, the sound of sirens blared behind him. A police car screeched to a halt, and before he could fully process what was happening, an officer was in front of him, demanding he stop. Elijah's heart raced as he tried to explain that he was simply heading to work. But the officer wasn't listening. In fact, he didn't even seem to believe Elijah's words. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with suspicion. "What's in the briefcase, sir? You're dressed too nice for someone like you. You don't belong here." The words stung. Elijah had heard things like this before, but never quite so bluntly. He was used to people doubting his qualifications, his status. But this time was different. This wasn't just a passing comment, it was an accusation. An assumption that he wasn't who he claimed to be. Slowly, Elijah's voice quavered as he tried to remain calm. "I'm Dr. Elijah Davis, and I'm on my way to work." But the officer didn't buy it. In his mind, Elijah's words were empty. The officer was convinced that Elijah was a fraud, a man who had no right to exist in this world of professionals. And that's when the cuffs came out. The officer's grip on Elijah's arm was tight, and with each passing second, the reality of the situation settled in. Elijah was being arrested. For what? Walking down the street in the wrong neighborhood, wearing the wrong clothes. The officer's questions grew more hostile, more accusatory. "What's in the briefcase?" the officer demanded again, his hand now resting on his taser, his eyes scanning Elijah's every move. "Where's your ID? You're not even wearing a name tag. Are you sure you're really a doctor?" Elijah, already shaken, tried to explain again, his voice steady but growing more desperate. "I'm Dr. Elijah Davis. I work at the city hospital. I have an appointment. Please, check my credentials." But the officer wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. There was no reason for Elijah to be there. There was no way a black man dressed in a suit could possibly be a respected doctor. Not in this neighborhood. The tension in the air was palpable. A small crowd had gathered, but no one dared to speak out. They watched in silence, some with fear, others with confusion. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel his pulse in his temples, in his fingertips. His dignity, his very humanity was being stripped away before his eyes. "Let me go," Elijah said, his voice rising. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're making a mistake." But the officer's grip only tightened. "Tell it to the judge," he sneered as he roughly handcuffed Elijah's wrists. The cold metal dug into Elijah's skin, and with each twist of the officer's hand, he felt the last remnants of control slip away. The crowd watched, some muttering to themselves, others shaking their heads. Elijah's mind raced, but no words seemed to come out. The officer pushed him into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut behind him. Inside, Elijah's heart felt heavy. The walls of the car seemed to close in around him. His mind replayed the events over and over again, his calm demeanor, his peaceful walk, his polite attempts to explain himself. But none of that mattered. None of that had saved him from being judged, from being treated like a criminal. But just as the officer prepared to drive away, a voice crackled through his radio. It was a voice Elijah hadn't expected to hear. It was the dispatcher. "Sir, we've just received a confirmation. Dr. Elijah Davis is scheduled to be at the hospital this morning. He's the chief resident of neurology." The officer froze. He didn't know what to say. He had made a mistake, a huge one. He had arrested a doctor, a respected professional, a man who had saved lives, not taken them. For the first time, the officer began to doubt himself. He turned to Elijah, his face flushed with embarrassment. "You're really a doctor?" Elijah didn't respond. He just looked at the officer. His eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. The officer had refused to see him as a human being. He had refused to believe in the possibility of a black man being successful, being qualified. But now the truth was undeniable, and the officer realized, far too late, that the very man he had humiliated was someone he could never have imagined. As the officer's shock began to set in, Elijah remained calm, despite the chaos swirling around him. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just any man walking the street. He was a doctor, one who had been on the front lines of countless surgeries, who had spent years studying and working to save lives. And yet, all of that was ignored because of the color of his skin. The officer stood there for a moment, speechless. The truth hung in the air like an uncomfortable silence. But Elijah wasn't done. He turned to the officer, his voice steady but filled with the weight of everything that had just transpired. "You don't know me. You didn't know my name, my work, my value. You just saw my skin and assumed I didn't belong." The officer's face went pale. His apology felt empty, hollow. Elijah knew this wasn't about a simple mistake. It was about something much deeper. It was about the systemic racism that had shaped the officer's worldview. It was about the deep-seated prejudices that had clouded his judgment and led to this moment of humiliation. Elijah's hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his medical badge. He slid it across the table in front of the officer, the weight of it settling between them. "I don't need your apology," Elijah said quietly. "But maybe you'll think twice before you treat another person like this, before you make assumptions based on nothing but fear." The officer took the badge, his hands shaking. He couldn't look Elijah in the eye. He had just realized the depth of his ignorance, the enormity of his mistake. But it was too late to take back the humiliation he had caused. The twisted irony wasn't lost on Elijah. Here he was, a doctor, someone who had spent years dedicating his life to healing and saving, now fighting to prove his worth. But in that moment, Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. The system that had allowed this kind of treatment to happen wasn't going to change overnight. But this incident, this public humiliation, would be the beginning of something bigger. Elijah wasn't just going to let this go. He wasn't going to be silent. The officer was placed on administrative leave as an internal investigation was launched. His actions had been deemed unacceptable, and the city police department took swift action. Elijah's story was picked up by local news, and what started as a single act of injustice soon sparked a broader conversation about race, bias, and professional recognition. In the following weeks, Elijah received letters from patients, colleagues, and even strangers expressing their support and admiration for his courage. His story had ignited a fire within the community, reminding everyone of the importance of challenging prejudice and standing up for what is right. As for Elijah, he returned to his work at the hospital, but something had changed. He had become a symbol of resilience. He had shown that no matter how many times society tried to undermine his worth, he would continue to rise. His commitment to his patients, to his work, and to justice was unwavering. Though the officer's career was forever tarnished, Elijah's was only just beginning. He became more vocal about racial discrimination in the workplace and used his platform to educate others. He helped lead conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in medicine, pushing for systemic change that would ensure no one else would ever have to go through what he did. This wasn't just Elijah's victory. This was a win for every person who had been judged unfairly, every person who had been made to feel invisible. It was a reminder that we must always see the humanity in others, no matter their race or background. Elijah Davis had fought back against the injustice that tried to define him, and in doing so, he became a beacon of hope for those who would follow. Elijah's story is a reminder of the power of persistence in the face of prejudice. How many times have we judged someone based solely on their appearance? How many of us have allowed our assumptions to blind us to the truth? Elijah's experience shows us that no one should ever have to prove their worth based on the color of their skin or the way they look. If you've ever experienced or witnessed something similar, share your story below. Let's continue this conversation, because change begins when we stand together and challenge the injustices we see.